Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We have an international group here. As usual from Zoom, some of the people were commenting about the real benefit of the Zoom in our lives, and it has really expanded our reach and our vision. So today we're going to talk about the 12 concepts. Very little energy around the 12 concepts in most of the 12-step fellowship environments. It's probably the least known and the least paid attention to, and yet probably has as much power as the other two legacies, the legacies that we talk about in most of the 12-step fellowships are the steps, that first legacy, and then the people who really catch fire with regard to the steps and its transforming power usually have some at least nodding acquaintance with the traditions, if not applicable to the group, at least applicable to their personal lives. And this is today at least a nodding acquaintance with the concepts, and we'll look at them three at a time. I believe I'm going to come up with a prayer here. Yes. So this is not an official prayer for those of you who may not be familiar with it. It's more an attitude that's expressed in words that we call a prayer. The attitude is to have an open mind and open heart. It's human nature. There's nothing wrong with any one of you in this area. It's human nature to become very rote, almost brain dead to the words that we use regularly. Words like powerless. I mean, literally, it should raise goosebumps on your flesh when you say the word, although we become immune to the power of that word. I try to use the word, as many of you know, no choice, when I think about or want to communicate why we're all here in a 12-step program. Most of us have come to a 12-step program because of an addiction of some kind. Fortunately, the doors are wide open. It started with alcohol, but then became very, very prominent in the Al-Anon, 1951, and then in so many other areas of human mischief and misbehavior. And this prayer is expressive of an attitude to have an open mind and heart, a willingness to have an open mind and heart, a willingness. But it's a prayer. Many of you have seen the prayer, maybe even pray the prayer. God, please give me the power to set aside. Or please, God, help me set aside. That was my original prayer. I used it for years until in my meditation, I began to chuckle because it allowed me to stay in at least the delusion of control. God, help me. Yeah, no, not so much. Please, God, come directly to me. Your spirit, crowbar in hand, to open my mind and open my heart, because I don't know that I don't know, and I can't see that I can't see. And even though I believe I'm willing, my behavior suggests otherwise. So it's a very direct prayer for intervention. And here, most of us are coming because we don't have a lot of information or experience with the concepts. As I mentioned before we were recording it, or maybe at the very beginning, it's the least legacy. There's three: the steps and the traditions and the concepts. It's the one that gets the least attention by the majority of people, and it's totally natural and human. And I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to facilitate a discussion on these 12 concepts. So for the next couple hours, let's pray that the Spirit enters each of our hearts and minds and opens it up to some new information, some new experience, perhaps to give us some new momentum in our own personal development in the way we contribute to helping others. God, please set aside everything that I think I know about myself, the 12 concepts, my practical application, and you, for an open mind and a new experience with myself, the 12 concepts, my practical application, and especially you. The language of the heart has lots of wonderful information on the concepts. I'd like to read a paragraph just as a meditation here in the milieu of this set-aside attitude and prayer. Our 12th step, carrying the message, is the basic service that AA's fellowship gives. This is our principal aim and main reason for existence. We're pretty bullseye comments. Carrying the message, the principal aim, and the main reason for our existence, AA's existence. Therefore, AA is more than a set of principles. It is a society of alcoholics in action. We must carry the message, else we ourselves can wither, and those who haven't been given the truth will die. Hence, an AA service is anything whatever that helps us to reach a fellow sufferer. I'm going to repeat that. It's such a comprehensive, all-inclusive concept or thought about carrying the message. An AA service is anything whatever that helps us to reach a fellow sufferer, ranging all the way from the 12th step itself to a 10-cent phone call, that'll date the information, and a cup of coffee, and to AA's General Service Headquarters for National and International Action. The sum total of all, in italics, all, these services is our third legacy. Anything we do to carry and or support the carry of the message. Well, what's the message? Having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. That's the only message that is the priority message. Having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. Please join me in the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Well, as I mentioned, There are three legacies. Some of you may be familiar with, some of you may not be, this vocabulary. That first legacy was contained in the big book when it was first published, April 1939. It's 12 steps. The book, in its essential, has not been changed since the original printing, April 1939. Oh, of course, some of the numbers have changed in the sense of the history of the growth of the fellowship. The only substantive change in the big book is the 12th step itself. In the very first printing, April 1939, it read the 12th step, having had a spiritual experience. Within months after its publication, Bill realized that that's not the majority experience. The majority experience is what he then later termed a spiritual awakening. So he changed spiritual experience to spiritual awakening, and he put Appendix 2 in the back of the book. In the very next printing, the second printing of the big book, 1941. So pay attention to Appendix 2. A lot of people don't read Roman numerals. A lot of people don't read forewords and prefaces. A lot of people don't read appendixes. It's okay. I understand that. But please, the entire mission and purpose and value of this method called the 12-step fellowship is described in Appendix 2. I have a practice now of starting out with a person who wants to go through the steps, or with my workshops that begin in January and July, looking at, that's the very first assignment, Appendix 2, because it describes the mission and the value proposition, having had a spiritual awakening. What is it? How does it contrast to a spiritual experience, and how is it the same? Wonderful questions. I won't spend our time today with that. But if you haven't asked yourself those questions and answered those questions, what is a spiritual experience? What is a spiritual awakening? How are they the same and how are they different? Read and spend some time with Appendix 2. In 1950, the first international conference ratified the 12 traditions, not as rules and regulations. Bill said, we don't need rules and regulations. These are guidelines based on our experience. In fact, he uses a wonderful metaphor, image, hammered out on the anvil of experience, that blacksmith metaphor. So, I mean, hot fire and lots of energy hammering out these traditions. But they're guidelines, principles. Like the steps are principles, practice these principles in all our affairs. Bill uses the word principle in the big book on page 60 as a synonym for steps, because he doesn't like to use the same word in consecutive sentences. Practice these principles mean practice these steps. And the principles inherent in each of the steps. The 12 traditions are not rules and regulations, they're principles to guide us. Principles to help the group itself monitor itself. Bill indicated that as the steps are for the reduction, the deflation of the personal ego, the traditions are for the reduction and deflation of the group ego. He was a master at psychology, even though he had not been officially educated in psychology. He was brilliant in terms of his intuitions and his understanding about human behavior. But today we're going to look at another segment of the third legacy. Bill calls it the 12 principles to guide a nonprofit spiritual organization. The steps for the individual, the traditions for the group, the concepts for the actual business organization. Now, many people take those concepts, those principles, into their personal lives as applications as they do the traditions and obviously the steps. If you have some experience with the concepts, I encourage you to share it with us today. Many of us do not. I do not have experience, literal experience with the application of the concepts because I've never been involved in the service structure of Alcoholics Anonymous. I made an effort in my first year to be part of a very light touch central service office, CSR. And I just found that my personality isn't very conducive to being in those kinds of discussions and groups and committees. My personality is called in a different direction. But thank God there's wonderful people involved with the general service structure and the administration organization of AA to support carrying the message. That's the whole point here. This workshop, in a very light way, has assignments. You've seen them in the material if you've downloaded them from the website on the concepts section. There's lots of resources there concerning worksheets and assignments and etc. The major part is reading from, as I mentioned, the language of the heart, perhaps being generally aware of the manual for the concepts that's on the Alcoholics Anonymous website. I've taken the liberty to also transfer it over to and have the capacity to download it from my own website. There's some reflections on the concepts themselves, both short and long form, which is what we'll be doing today. Perhaps you've already done some reading and some writing and some reflecting. You'll share that with us today, or these worksheets allow you to actually make notes on what people comment on today. Our discussion is set up, it's by my standards anyway, it's really superficial in contrast to the work that I do on the steps, which is a very deep dive. The work I have done on the traditions, which is a shallow by the steps measurement, but still a deep enough dive in the traditions. There's a recording on the playlist that was mentioned earlier, the YouTube playlist, that was done in a workshop over 14 weeks. So there was a relatively good, solid deep dive into the traditions. In contrast to what we do with the concepts, shallow by my standards anyway, and we look at 3 concepts each workshop. Today we'll be looking at concepts 4, 5, and 6. Not necessarily just from the head as our understanding, but one of the mechanics of transformation was when it went filtered through my heart to my feet is when I began to change. The emphasis here, and I might be giving it more emphasis than I have previously, is that the concepts are, the principles are to support an organization, a business organization, a nonprofit business organization, a nonprofit business spiritual organization. That upside down pyramid that is so countercultural. The individuals and the individual groups are the stockholders, and the General Service Office, etc., take their direction from those individual groups in an annual conference to make sure that the structure of support of General Service Office is maximizing its effectiveness in carrying the message. Bill says it on chapter 7, the first line. Nothing will so much ensure immunity. Boy, we're so sensitive today because of the pandemic to those words. Immunization, inoculation. If we want to have our addiction disease neutralized, that's the promise at the end of the 9th step, page 84 in the big book. Placed, listen to it, placed, meaning grace, delivered, Bill used that word, he was delivered to neutrality. He was delivered to freedom. He was delivered to freedom from his addiction. And eventually, as he understood his experience and codified it in the 12 steps, he realized he was delivered from his unmanageability. Empowered. Yes, step 1 is lack of power. And step 12 signals that now you've been empowered. It's a great coming full circle message. Delivered, meaning grace, and yet it's at the end of the 9th step, which means our willingness to take action. And there's the magic formula, that combination of willingness and grace. There's no way I can explain it, because there's a mystery here, someplace in it, where there's a touch point of willingness and grace. I don't know when it will happen. None of us can control when it will happen. Sometimes it happens before there's any work or even awareness, and sometimes it happens at the conclusion of a lot of work and awareness, or someplace in between. But this is the point of the concepts. Principles that support the business of administration. Bill says in step 12. Step 12 is a very concentrated set of principles. Spiritual awakening, carry the message, practice principles. Each one of those could be a separate workshop, and have been. Practice. Such a great word. Many of you have heard me say that there's a title of a book in that, Practicing Life. Yeah, we practice life. We never get it quite right because we're not perfect and never will be perfect, neither in our understanding nor our application. But we practice and we get better. We get better at it. Practicing in our relationships, in our families, at our workplace, in our community, and in our fellowship. Essentially, chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11 in the big book. Not named specifically this way, but that's the essence of it. Principles like the principle of physics, the law of gravity. The law of gravity. It's non-negotiable and immutable. It doesn't change. It's not negotiable. It doesn't matter what we think, feel, want, or say, or who we are even. The whole point of emotional sobriety. is to determine what are the principles of reality and then to adjust to them. These are principles that we'll be looking at. There's a quote in the manual about the purpose of these principles: freedom. Freedom from addiction, certainly, but freedom from unmanageability, freedom under God to grow in God's image and likeness. These are words from Bill Wilson. Wasn't spiritually trained, but from his experience, I believe, both from the mountaintop he had in the second or third day of his detoxing in the hospital, December 1934, and then from his accumulated knowledge and wisdom and experience over time as he was writing these various things, especially the steps in the big book. Freedom under God to grow in God's image and likeness will ever be the quest of Alcoholics Anonymous, to grow in the image and likeness of whatever this original creator, this infinite reality is. Our freedom to serve is truly the freedom by which we have our being, the freedom in which we have our being. These are meditations, more than one. This freedom that is promised, I almost said guaranteed, and I would mean that too, at the end of the 9th step, page 84, placed in a position of neutrality. But not freedom from unmanageability as an event, but freedom from unmanageability as a process. Not cured, daily reprieve. Our freedom to serve is truly the freedom by which we have our being. We perfect and enlarge our spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others. That's a line from the big book in Bill's story, page 14 at the end. We perfect and enlarge our spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others. Self-sacrifice. Sacrifice coming from the Latin sacer, meaning holy, priestly, and facere, meaning to make or to do. Somehow, it's almost counterintuitive, but it's captured in the paradox. We keep it by giving it away. Makes no sense in the sense of the practical understanding of the words, but it makes total sense when we apply it. We keep it by giving it away. We grow it by sharing it, enlarging our spiritual life. It's the word I use now for step 12, in contrast to the word I use for step 11, which is improve. I use the word improve in step 11 because it's in the step itself. The mission, the purpose, the value, the total bullseye of step 11. To improve my consciousness. That's a vertical kind of concept. Whereas enlarge my consciousness is a horizontal. We're at the crossroads. In step 11, in our relationship with a higher power, and in step 12, by sharing it on our path with others. The freedom in which we have our being. So who is coming to help them? You've seen this, perhaps, if you've seen my work before. We are the one they are waiting for. We are the one they are waiting for. All right. So those are my opening comments. Hope they were helpful in sort of setting the stage for our discussion. I'd like to begin with concept 4, and then we'll go to 5, and then we'll go to 6. Concept 4 is throughout our conference structure, we ought to maintain at all responsible levels a traditional right of participation, taking care that each classification or group of our world servants shall be allowed a voting representation in reasonable proportion to the responsibility that each must discharge. I'm reading from the Concepts Illustrated, a wonderful, at least beginning, simple approach to each of the concepts. The first concept set us up in terms of the purpose of the concepts. It's for the total application of organizational principles. And it's about delegated responsibility. The steps, of course, are for the individual, the traditions are for the group, and the concepts for the business to sustain the system itself, to guide people within the business, but also the stockholders of the business, the individuals and the groups that actually direct the organization. If you have knowledge of and or experience with each of these concepts as we go forward, raise your hand, or if you have questions, certainly about it. I do not pretend at all to have even a solid working relationship with the concepts. I can read and I can comment on it, but I don't have any on the ground or feet on the ground experience with the concepts, as I do with the traditions and as I certainly do with the steps. So I'm looking very much for your input, your support, your questions, your challenges, not necessarily to me, but to the group that is participating here. There's a short and long form. You saw that in the material that I have supplied for your consideration as you're doing this work. The notes I made here in concept 4, in terms of the right of participation, is really talking about the minority group in a discussion that has always heard. And that it's never going to be a simple majority vote. It's going to be a sort of a reasonable proportion, some type of a major direction. I know there's a word for it. I'm not getting it as I'm talking. But Bill Wilson talked about these qualities of tolerance and responsibility and flexibility and keeping the vision in mind as to what we want to do. That one word of help. As many of you know, I dropped the word service probably 25, 30 years ago. In my meditation, the voice said, it's too sophisticated, Herb. Drop the word service. It's got too much fanciness to it. And it said, use the word help, because it's got earth or dirt in it. Literally, the voice said to me, it has dirt in it. You will get frustrated. You will sweat. You will, get tired in helping in whatever way that you determine that you can or try.
Yeah, I was interested in this. I think the term that you were searching for was substantial majority.
That's it.
That's it. That's really concept 5 where they talked about that. So we'll be visiting that. But this one confuses me. And I got to tell you, man, I'm just out to lunch on this thing. The dog ate my homework and then I ate the dog. So it's like this work is kind of fallen by the wayside. I just printed out the Concepts Illustrated, which, like the Traditions Illustrated, is just fantastic. It's just a fantastic thing. But it's got something here that I find interesting. Now, they talk about all the different types of people involved with this structure, and I need to find the definitions of these delegates, trustees, directors, and staff. But I find it interesting that both the short form, the long form, and the illustrated says throughout our conference structure, we ought to maintain at all responsible levels a traditional right of participation. I get that. Okay, I get that. Taking care that each classification or group of our world servants shall be allowed, and I quote, a voting representation in reasonable proportion to the responsibility that each must discharge. And I'm thinking, okay, each classification or group, and I think by classification, they must mean delegates, trustees, directors, or staff, I'm not sure, or group, shall be allowed a voting representation in reasonable proportion to the responsibility that each must discharge. So that doesn't necessarily mean one person, one vote, or one group, one vote.
Yeah.
It's, I find that terminology confusing, and I was wondering if maybe among the crowd here, there's somebody who's done this stuff.
This is what I'm hoping for, this kind of question and or challenge, and reach out to people for their interpretation and or their experience. And we can't do it wrong here. We're just sharing our thoughts and our opinions. It's fine, and our experience. But that's one of the questions actually in the
homework I didn't do.
No, don't do that. in the concepts checklist. No, in the concepts checklist. Do we understand the spiritual principles underlying the right of participation? The spiritual principles of right of participation, meaning really everybody has a vote. Everybody's important. I think that's the spiritual principle. And then what does reasonable proportion mean? And I'm accepting the challenge. I don't actually, from my experience, don't have. I mean, I could make something up, but I don't have any interpretation from somebody who actually knows what they're talking about.
Hi, I have to share just a little thing that I had happen that makes me understand that totally. There was a young lady who was very excited about her ability to work with delegates and be a part of the bigger AA community, the movers and shakers, or whatever you're calling them. I'm sorry, I get a little nervous talking. But
leadership people.
Leadership people, right, at next level. And they were very excited because they had all kinds of changes. Things could be done, and they were, in their early sobriety, maybe 5 years, 6 years, but they had tremendous changes that they wanted to implement, and they were quite upset that they were told they couldn't do that commitment, that they really weren't that person fit in, and the person was very upset. But I kind of saw in listening to the complaint process from the person that they weren't humble enough to hear everything. They were maybe a little too new. So that was just my experience. They heard him, they allowed her, but when it came right down to it, the people had been there longer, could see that this moving and shaking was not centered around humility. So that's my experience with it.
Yeah. And people with knowledge and experience will be able to, in a gracious, hopefully way, kind and tolerant, put some parameters around people with enthusiasm, but not with knowledge and experience, because we're very, the whole point of the step process is to address we're very self-centered. And I know in my case, I did not know that. And until some people have some experience with the 12 steps, and really good sponsorship, they don't get it. That in fact, they may not know exactly that they don't know exactly. So yeah, and thinking about that reasonable proportion that Bob raised this as a question. So for instance, if you're a staff member in the actual business organization, then there is a supervisor that has direct responsibility for you're doing your job and or not doing your job, and would have the ability to hire you or fire you. And so that would be a proportionate authority, whereas a person in a group like you're just talking about, a person in a group or relatively new to even the inner workings of the General Service Conference, might not be from an experience standpoint, might not have that ability to share something that would be helpful, because they just don't have either the knowledge of the accuracy and or the experience of its application, right?
Hi. Well, my experience was I was a GSR for our local district.
Yeah,
And then I went to an assembly, which is our statewide group. And there was probably 400 people there. And there was one group that was there that was Spanish speaking. And what the assembly did was vote to have, this was prior to the actual assembly, they voted to pay for a translator to support the Spanish speaking. There was actually two groups that were just Spanish speaking. And so they also interpreted both ways, you know, and so the groups could say and vote yay or nay, but they would know what they're voting for, you know, in terms of all the business that was being done. So
yeah.
So.
And Bob had mentioned a question concerning the various categories of people, and as I understand it, that's very relevant to Concept 4. The categories are the volunteers, of course, at one level, and then the directors and staff of the General Service Office, and then the trustees. The volunteer, of course, being the people that come up through, as you just mentioned, the rank of being a GSR for a group that then becomes active in the district meetings and then the area meetings. And there's a person that out of that group is elected to represent all of those groups in the area. I think it's called the DCM. And then that person is the person that I believe is nominated to go to the General Service Conference that meets once a year. And that's got to be thousands of people that meet to discuss and decide on some of the policies and direction and literature of the General Service Organization. That General Service Organization has a board of trustees that in fact operates directing the business. And there's two different boards, one for the General Service Office and one for the Grapevine, as I understand it.
Correct.
So there's a lot of moving parts, all with delegated responsibilities, but the real point of this and the importance of your role as a GSR is that the GSR is really the person who is representing the General Service Conference to the meeting and representing the group to the General Service Conference. So it's actually it's a lot more important position than in fact it gets credit for in our communities. Yeah.
So I'm in Overeaters Anonymous, and so I don't know anything about GSRs and all that. There may be something that's comparable. But
I assume there's a parallel organization. They may use different words, but I would assume a parallel organization. Go ahead, please.
Right, probably so. So in OA, we have a board of trustees, and all of them can vote except for the head of the trustees. Now, she or he can, if there's a tie vote, can eliminate the tie, but they can't vote on any issue unless there is a tie. The other thing is that, and you all may have already covered this a little bit.
Well, before you go on with that, that
Uh-huh.
doesn't sound like how AA would operate.
Oh,
The AA would never, I don't believe, based on my knowledge of it from reading, would never try to adjudicate a tie. They don't do a majority vote. They do a substantial. Bob made the comment of the word. Bob, what was the word again? The phrase? Substantial unanimity, was it? Yeah. So they wouldn't, I don't believe they would ever go for a quote tiebreaker. That's yeah. So
that's a little different then.
it would be incredibly different. Yeah.
Yeah, very much different. And the other thing is that, and this is where I'm thinking that you all may have been talking about this, and because I don't understand all the terminology that's used,
Right.
I may not know, whether it's been discussed or not. But there are people that are called, what are they called? I can't think now. But there are people that if I have a note and I need to pass it to somebody else, I have to raise my hand, and they come and get it and take it to the other person. Now, they have no other rights except to quietly go from person to person carrying notes. So they're in the room, but they have no voting rights. And in addition to that, there are other people in the room that can come and just observe and have no voting rights. Now, I don't know whether that's what you're talking about. Maybe not. I don't really know.
I'm not talking about that at all. That's not in my consciousness at all, what you're talking about. I understand in a way what it is. And I do believe the General Service Conference, the annual meeting, is open. People who are not, quote, sent by a group or others could in fact go there. They probably are not allowed to express their opinions because they're not an authorized or official person there. But so as I understand it, the groups have a representative that meets at a area meeting. The area has representatives that meet in a larger area. Then there's a delegate that's elected from that group that goes to the annual conference to represent that area and those groups, not in the sense of the same representing them in the same sense that if it's their group's opinion that you do one thing and there's a discussion about doing something else, the actual role of the delegate is not to represent the group's opinion, but to be there representing the group to think through what's being presented and to, in an intelligent and informed way, then vote in the context of that particular meeting. I'm maybe not being as clear as I want.
No, I understand. So there's one other role that I just thought of is the parliamentarian. Do you have something like that in AA?
I think they do use Robert's rules of managing the meeting. I've seen that someplace. I've not been there, so I can't speak from experience. Yeah, maybe
they don't have a vote. They're an entity that's up there at with the trustees and whatnot, but they do not have a vote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's all I can think of.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Yeah. No. We're having a discussion among people who doesn't sound like we all have very much information and or practical experience. Well, but we can discuss it in a way because we've read some things or we've heard some things or we have some experience with it. So I appreciate your comments.
Thank you.
Let's take a look at concept 5. I'm looking at the worksheets that I developed for a workshop that I did a couple of decades ago, actually. And the short form of the 12 concept. Throughout our structure, a traditional right of appeal. So they've got these phrases that have a very specific purpose and meaning. It's in quotes, the right of appeal ought to prevail so that minority opinion will be heard and personal grievances receive careful consideration. One of the comments I made earlier when we were talking about the tie vote conversation, my notes here confirm that it's normally a 2/3 vote that's required, not just a 51%, but a 2/3 vote at a minimum in terms of a direction of a change and or a consideration. My notes on right of appeal and right of petition. It protects individual freedom. It supports voicing minority opinion. And although, again, I don't have experience, but I've read about other people's experience where the minority opinion that was expressed and then seriously considered by this annual meeting, the minority opinion actually became the majority opinion as it was expressed and explained and discussed. It completely turned the entire conference around because they were able then to finally understand it specifically and to consider it, which is just a marvelous democracy that represents that each person and each group literally has some recognizable and considered power to be able to express and influence a direction. Very much in the spirit of the group conscience, the group trusting that underneath is the spirit of God, this God consciousness that is informing, meaning giving it life, informing, giving this whole body consciousness life and direction. And the body consciousness is listening to discern. My notes say, fostering the spirit of true democracy. A 51% vote is directional, my notes again. A 51% vote, they do take something like that and honor it. It's directional, it's not binding. But the 2/3 quorum is binding on the trustees. The 2/3, once you get that level of support. Anybody have comments on the right of appeal and the right of petition, other than what we've talked about from a common sense standpoint?
Yeah, so my group, it's AA, my AA group is doing a group inventory. So that was, it's outside the actual meeting and we meet at a separate time. And we do an inventory of how our group is doing.
Yes.
And you take a vote on whatever the topic is, and whoever are the minority, the people that voted against it, get to, after we take the vote and it passes, they then, either one of them or all of them, whoever in the minority, can get up and talk again. And then we take another vote to see if it changed anybody's mind and if it switched and went the other way. No. So it's when I first came in, I just went, oh my God, this is the slowest process I've ever been through in my entire life. It just takes forever, especially like the assembly level. Oh my goodness. One vote can take an hour because they keep wanting to talk and the minority gets to keep talking, And so But what it does is make, when you're done and over, everyone is happy because they were heard. Even though they might not have gone the way they wanted to go, they were heard. And that was the important piece of doing it that way. And I really got that everybody was heard.
And if you, yes, thank you so much for that. And if you put it in the context of my prior conversation about the group conscious, like you do here, and you're really trusting the spirit here. And so you're listening to the minority group, if you will, as a legitimate expression of the spirit. And it may not be, in fact, helpful to the body in general, but it is respected at the level that this is an interpretation of somebody that might really have something of significance for the general population. Yeah.
All right, me again. Well, I think this concept reminds me so much of tradition too, because they're talking about the one authority, a loving God as he may express himself in our group conscience.
Yeah.
So here's the deal. I remember, I can't remember the particulars, but here's what I remember is it's similar to what it's talking about here, is that somebody brought up something and everybody agreed with them and we were about ready to vote. And then another person brought up something that was contrary to the majority, thought or whatever, and turned people's consciousness around totally.
Right.
And we voted the other way.
Yeah.
So I was just looking at the AA information on concept 5, and there are a couple of things that I'd like to just read because they're very informational.
Please.
It says, in the light of the principle of the right of appeal, all minorities, whether in our staffs, committees, corporate boards, or among trustees, should be encouraged to file minority reports whenever they feel a majority to be in considerable error. It goes on to say, the well-heard minority, therefore, is our chief protection against an uninformed, misinformed, hasty, or angry majority.
Yeah.
I think that really, really, for me, brings it all together, that the majority can still be wrong, even though they're the majority. And if just even one person comes up with a different solution that's actually more accurate or more palatable or whatever the word is, then people tend to listen. I mean, like my experience, people tend to listen and then change their vote. So that's all I wanted to say.
Well, and I think thank you for that contribution, because it is reminding us that human nature kind of crowd oriented. We kind of go with the flow if it's a major flow, and we don't want to be kind of like contrarian. And yet if there's somebody there that has information and or experience that could sober us up, what you said in your words, I'm so glad that you read them, that anger and or fear can motivate a group in a direction that gets its own momentum, and it's not necessarily healthy. So yeah, no, that's thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you, Herb.
Yeah, you bet.
Yes, I'd like to say I saw this in practice, and one person when the determination of a meeting going back live and becoming a hybrid meeting came up, one person voted no, and she was absolutely right. And she said this, and I really, really wanted this hybrid meeting because we'd been on Zoom for a year, and I did not, and I moved up where I live now, and this is an LA meeting, and said, this has always been this meeting, and we've always had it here, and that's what it is. And everybody's being nice when they say they want to make a hybrid meeting, but nobody knows how to do it. We don't have the equipment, and I don't think that we're going to enjoy it. And I think it's going to interfere with our meeting. And I said, my God, I'm being so selfish wanting to keep this meeting. I said, so I popped my hand up and said, she's absolutely right, absolutely right. And everybody just changed their vote, and boom. And then I got to come to your meeting twice a week. I got to hear the So that's the way it was running on 2020. You were like, I think Tuesday, Wednesday.
Yes.
Yeah. And I got to come and hear the thing live
Yeah.
on Tuesday, and now I'm hooked, and you're never going to get rid of me, Herb.
No, I hope not. That's
I'm like
great.
a tapeworm.
No, no. You're like a disciple.
Yeah, well, one of those didn't work out very well, Herb.
Morning, Herb. Thanks everybody for all your input. You know, in the illustrated, it has a phrase in there that just grabs me. This concept also warns us of the tyranny of the majority.
That's the point.
That is so right on. And it's kind of funny because I missed my Friday meeting because of the roundup last week. And apparently one of the members brought forth the idea that she didn't like, we do a hybrid meeting there, and she didn't like it because she found it distracting.
Yeah.
And so she was told, well, we'll have to take a vote on it. And of course I thought, well, we're not going to vote for that. But, you know, this tells me I need to listen to what this woman has to say.
Yeah.
You know, we may be very well intentioned with whatever it is we want to do, but we're not always right just because we have good intentions. And,
well, but see, that's
you know,
a very healthy. Thank you for bringing that into the practical application in the group itself, not at the General Service Conference, but in your very individual group. We similarly, my home group I've been going to from the very beginning, and it's been on a Wednesday night, and we accommodated COVID by going to Zoom, and then as we were modifying COVID, and we went back to physical, and we went to hybrid, and we found it very, very manageable as a group. But there's a group in there that didn't like the hybrid because it had always been just a physical meeting without the interference and potential distraction of the technology. And after several weeks of sometimes heated discussion, but always in the spirit, hopefully, of the best welfare of everybody, there was a contingent of people, and I mean over 10 people, that felt so strongly about it that they left the meeting and started another meeting that is physical only without the hybrid meeting. And my home group continued with the hybrid. So there's a solution that might in fact mean that we get a coffee pot and start our own meeting, you know, that drill. But everybody, quote, was satisfied. We have a group, and the good news is now we have a separate group on a separate night with a separate format. So it's a good thing. Now, instead of one meeting a week, we've got 2 meetings a week that people can go to.
Mhm.
Yeah. So that even though the discussion perhaps at some points was disappointing in terms of the lack of spirituality, the outcome was in fact wonderful. Yeah.
Good morning.
Hi.
When I was doing my reading for concept, I just kind of got enthralled with it, and I ended up we have our Friday night. I'm in Al-Anon. Our Friday night meeting is a discussion meeting, so I did it on concept 5. And one of it really amounts to just a series of questions that open up discussion on different aspects. And so one of the questions in there was about, you know, being heard. And I think that's, it really caught everybody's attention, because it's probably, you know, and one of the people whose attention it really caught was somebody who's been in the program probably 20 or 30 years. And it was like, being heard, you know, what's your experience with that? How do you like it? What do you feel like when you're not heard? So it was just, you know, that made that concept very, very personal to everybody. And it was a good discussion. And I think that, you know, we've got people in our group that aren't heard because they don't want to raise their voice yet, you know,
Right.
And that's fine. That's where they are at that point. But, you know, I always look, there's so many ways in the program that we can plant seeds. And I'm hoping that meeting helped them know that they do have a right to be heard when they're ready to speak. That's all I wanted to share. Thanks.
Right. And encouraged to speak, because there's a potential contribution that can be made, at the very least, that they become part of that community. It's pretty classic from my experience, especially in my workshops, that 20% of the people do 80% of the talking. And I try to create a safe space for people to feel like they can begin to, even with sort of trepidation, they can begin to at least share their name and become visible in the community. It's really good for people to participate from many aspects, not the least of which is then they feel part of a community, which then enlarges their entire spirit. Yeah.
Now, I'm so interested in all of this work is finding out how to apply it to the individual, but that's what
that's my intent with this work. Not that we're preparing anybody to be a GSR, because that's not the level of competency that I have to lead you or the group, apparently, but to get a sense of, oh, there's another spiritual principle and another arrow in my quiver that gives me a sense of developing, expanding my own consciousness. Yeah. Thanks so much. I'd like to continue with concept 6. The conference, that's the General Service Conference, recognizes that the chief initiative and active responsibility in most World Service matters should be exercised by the trustee members of the conference, acting as the General Service Board. So this is the board of directors, literally, of the business enterprise. I'm going to read the long form also. On behalf of AA as a whole, our General Service Conference, that's the annual conference, has the principal responsibility for the maintenance of our world services, meaning the support of carrying the message. And it traditionally has the final decision respecting large matters of general policy and finance. That's the key, general policy and finance. This is the board of trustees, a board of directors. But the conference also recognizes that the chief initiative and the active responsibility in most of these matters should be exercised primarily by the trustee members of the conference when they act among themselves and the General Service Board of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm not sure exactly what all of that means, other than it's an effective business operation. The delegates from the groups represent the geographical area and those groups, but they don't represent them in the sense of their opinions and or direction from the groups. They are there as individuals who are informed and given authority to listen to the General Service Conference and make decisions in the best interest of Alcoholics Anonymous itself as a worldwide organization. There is a question in my mind that I have not resolved that maybe somebody has an answer to, and that is the General Service Conference appears to be for North America. And then when I read that information, it seems like there must be a General Service Conference for other parts of the world, in contrast to North America or the Western Hemisphere. And maybe somebody has some knowledge and or comments about that. I didn't see any in my reading.
Yeah, I can't answer the international question, but I just one clarification. The delegates, like from the state, when they have the general service meeting, there are some issues that are known ahead of time, to vote on. And those come down through the pyramid of the structure to meetings. And so each meeting can vote on certain things. So the delegate does represent, and then that goes to the GSR, that goes to the district, to the area. So there is a way on some issues that the delegate is representing the meeting, but it's through, the system of area, then district and that. So,
Yeah.
so yeah, I just want to clarify that a little bit.
When anybody has observations and clarifications, everything's welcome here, please. Especially anybody who has been in any of the levels of service as a GSR, as you indicated, and the DCM, and then the delegate to the conference. Sometimes I wonder if that's part of an invitation to be active in that service structure, but every time I take it into meditation, it's the voice says, Herb, you're not built for it, so stay out of it.
You really get to practice the principles in all your affairs. Let me tell you.
I'm confident.
Oh my gosh, going to those business meetings or something else.
It's good that we can smile and laugh about it. That's right. Yeah.
Yes, Valerie, alcoholic. When I was telling my story earlier of this person who was having problems being accepted by, it was from a person from another country. It was, I've been to meetings in Zoom. I've gone to Latvia and Scotland, and I understand from my time there, which was quite a bit actually, they do have their own general service, et cetera, but it was quite interesting to me in the one case where it was all fairly new. I mean, fairly new meaning 30 years or 20 years, and many young people were running it. And the way they run things are quite different. I'm sure they'll learn as they go along, but it was quite different. Yeah, it was quite different than what we do here. I think we're very much more into the concepts and the traditions. And I had a feeling that they were having a problem with that. So thank you.
Yeah, my experience with other countries is that they don't have the depth of understanding at one side and experience on the other side, even of the steps, quite frankly, or of the big book, that there's an interpretation that might be sort of 30 to 40 years behind what we currently are thinking and experience. And, it's just what is, as you just said, that's the growing pains that they're going to be going through like we did in the past. And if they're open-minded, they can learn from our experience, but there's nothing like their own personal experience for it. Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah.
I have some experience with the English. In England, they have a general service office in New York, and they collect, and it works very much in the same way as it does in America. And they send the funds, the surplus funds, on to York, and York runs a general service office for the whole of England. So that I know for England. Now, regarding us in Israel, I'm representative of our home group in an intergroup, and the intergroup is a national group of representatives from the entire country, and we're trying very hard to elect at the moment a representative to go to the GSO, but we don't know how we can join. It's very complicated. The person who was before me, I'm treasurer also of our home group. The person who was treasurer before me and representative of the intergroup was American, and he could transfer funds from his own personal account to GSO, but I don't have an American account, and so I can't transfer our allocated funds to GSO in America. And so I've been writing to them, and writing backwards and forwards on email is very, very slow. So we're kind of in limbo, but we're getting our own act together, but we don't know how to join the bigger organization or to tap into their information and conferences, whatever. So that I haven't helped you, but I'm just telling you that we're a bit lost.
Well, okay, I understand that. Is there a direct contact that you have at GSO in New York that you could have a conversation with on the phone? Because it sounds clunky to be doing it by email.
I think I will do that. I will ask her to phone me so that I can report back to what we call the intergroup, which is the entire country. It's not even district, it's a small country, but
and that's part of the question I had is, what is the relationship outside of North America or Western civilization, if you will, with the other parts of the world? In other words, my initial question would be, well, why are you trying to support GSO? Why aren't you trying to support whatever comparable organization there is in your geography?
so I'm going to put it to vote now. We allocated lots of funds for GSO, and I'm going to request voting for reducing those funds for GSO to support our own intergroup that is responsible for translating literature and publicizing, doing buses and on buses and ads in the paper, whatever. Yeah, you're right. But GSO does provide us with the big book, and we need to fund GSO in the minimum that we can decide that will get the minimum surplus or whatever.
Yeah. Well, no, that makes total sense. And in fact, it may in fact be the way things are set up is that GSO of New York is in fact the pinnacle of the business organization for the world, and that there are GSOs in specific areas that have an ability to collect some funds to send to the GSO in New York for the translation services and the printing services. I see that, yeah. But I don't know whether anything I just said is actually the truth or valid.
Yeah, I hope that by the time we, before we end these concept workshops, that I'll have some answer.
Wonderful. Yeah. Because it's clear from the reading, or at least it's clear to me from the reading that I've done, that the General Service Office in New York has a limited geographical reach. And so I was wondering if there were parallel organizations throughout the world, like in Asia.
Yeah, but the only problem is they're manned, of course, by volunteers, and they're very slow in responding. So and they don't answer the phone. So, and we order books from them, and that takes forever. So that perhaps needs improvement. But I'll report, but I'll update you.
Yeah. Anytime I've dealt with staff at the GSO level, I found them very competent and very responsive. But you do have to get to the right person, because again, it's another quote bureaucracy, isn't it? Right. I started out by doing a little bit of conversation about, but at least by my standards, a little bit about we are the ones that they are waiting for. This Bill calls this our way of life. 20 different times in the big book, he uses that phrase. Not for steps 1 through 9. That's a process very much like an event. Steps 1 through 9. There are people that do it annually or maybe even more frequently, steps 1 through 9. There are people who do it periodically, steps 1 through 9. That was my experience in the first 20 years. I went through the steps with 4 different people, 4 different times. And it was helpful. It was helpful. I haven't gone through the steps in 20 years, from 1 through 12 on my own personal application. But Bill calls steps 10, 11, and 12 our way of life. Steps 1 through 9, I call the program of recovery. Bill called it the essential process for the deflation of the ego at depth. 1 through 9, the program of recovery. 1 through 9, the process to delivers us to a spiritual awakening. The promises, that change of life that is promised, spiritual awakening, done to us, not by us. But the big book is very clear. These promises that are at the end of the 9th step will always manifest. I'm paraphrasing. It says, if we work for them. And the work is 10, 11, and 12. The big book says, and this brings us to step 10. You see, we've entered the world of the spirit. The essential part of it is a vertical relationship with a power other than ourselves, and a horizontal, a relationship of contribution to the people around us. Bill had suggested in the 12 and 12 that step 10 and 11 are integral. Step 10 being inventory. Step 11, part of step 11 is inventory. Step 10, inventory during the day. Step 11, inventory at night, a meditation. This is our way of life, keeping the channel, us, we, the channel. Think of the St. Francis prayer. We're the channel, the life stream of God consciousness. We're the channel of consciousness to the environment and people around us. Inventory is a technique, the method for keeping that channel clear, and meditation is the tool to fill the channel. Bill uses the term keeping our head in the clouds as not fanciful or unrealistic, but in the sense of awareness of the presence of God. That's the term he uses in Appendix 2. He said the essence of a spiritual awakening, the essence of a spiritual experience is awareness of the presence of God. Awareness. But this is something that can, in fact, as a vision statement, as a goal for us, be 24/7. Awareness. Not to distract us from leading our life, but aware of the substrata of the spirit. As we were talking about in the concepts, as we talk about in the traditions, especially the group conscience. The assumption is underneath is the spirit, giving life and force and source and direction and guidance, both to the individual and to the group. Our way of living, keeping our head in the clouds, step 11 primarily, as I see it. And then keeping our feet on the ground, very humble, very simple, very grounded in the earth. Humble, humility, meaning humus, meaning earth or dirt, not in a negative interpretation or connotation, but in the sense of staying practical, staying sensible, staying simple, staying connected to action, feet on the ground. The whole purpose of this process. As human beings, the proper use of our mind, Bill says, page 85, is to develop our vision of God's will for us. The total purpose of this process is to carry a message by our very being to the people around us that there's hope. Head in the clouds, step 11. Feet on the ground, step 12. The application of principles. It's very concrete, the steps as principles. It's very concrete, the traditions as principles. It's very concrete, although maybe less so, the concepts. What we've discussed today in a general way are spiritual principles. The major point of the conversation, as I heard it and could participate in it, was about democracy. Every person's opinion counts, in the sense of needs to be considered, needs to be heard, needs to be legitimately reviewed and discussed, and with an open heart, open mind. We started out with the set aside attitude. I much prefer that than the set aside prayer. People's minds kind of shut almost automatically when you talk about prayer, especially something new. So I talk about the set aside attitude. That's the attitude I attempt to have in my conscious living of my day. An open mind and an open heart. Love and tolerance, Bill says, is our code. I believe consciousness is the key. The consciousness that comes from inventory. The consciousness that comes from spending some quiet time listening to our consciousness. It's a practice. And as a practice, we get better at it, and it becomes habitual that we're listening to our thinking, we're listening to our feelings, and then we're listening to other people's thinking and other people's feelings. Not that we are in any unhealthy way influenced by or directed by other people's thinking and feeling. That's the whole point of emotional sobriety, is we hold on to ourselves. That's a phrase that Dr. Berger has. We hold on to ourselves. We place the center of our gravity deep inside ourselves. The center of my gravity is not in circumstances. The center of my gravity is not in other people, certainly not the tyranny of the crowds, as one of the persons reminded us of. A wonderful phrase. I know who I am. I'm consciously fostering that on a daily basis. And I come from that place of independence, and yet I come from the place of a desire for interdependence. Melody Beattie uses that as the definition of healthy relationship, not codependent relationship. That is a sense of independence balanced by interdependence, balance. And I'm able to navigate life that way when I have my meditation practice, my awareness of the presence of God, and my listening to the guidance that connotes. And that when I spend most of my conscious time thinking about how can I contribute to others, how can I make the message more effective. This life, this way of life, this way of living. I converted it to a verb, I think that's the right word, rather than our way of life, which is a noun, I believe, our way of living, which is a verb. One of our senior people, Chuck C., said, love is a verb. It's about action. God is a verb. It's about action. My creator. That's the significance, I believe, of step 7. I'm going to ask us to pray our way today to close our time together with the version of the 7-step prayer. I call it the prayer of healing. I've changed the words because I want words to reflect my attitude. I want words to reflect my intention. Prayer is about intention. It's not about words. One of the gifts of going through this process originally was the man giving me the direction to write out my own 3rd-step prayer, to write out my own 7th-step prayer. It allowed me to take responsibility for the words and then to create words based on my intention. And those change over time, as you've seen me change the set-aside prayer based on the intention of the event, the intention of the discussion, the intention of my own consciousness at that particular time. The 7th-step prayer starts with my Creator. I believe it's a wonderful insight on Bill's part, coming after we've made a list of our character defects, or as Dr. Berger would call them, our unhealthy coping strategies, our default survival instincts. I seem to be built this way, and I need to be fine-tuned. I need to be rehabilitated. I need to be recreated. And I'm addressing my Creator to fix in general, but I also find the prayer very effective when I focus it specifically on what I'm conscious of at that time. And it's the prayer that ends with amen, in contrast to the 3rd-step prayer that doesn't have an amen. I believe, and my interpretation, I believe, is correct, that Bill meant the 3rd-step prayer to be the beginning of a process for the rehabilitation of my relationship with myself, steps 4 through 7. That 3rd-step prayer talking about who I am and that I'm open. And Bill says, it's only a beginning. And I believe that's the reason there's no amen at the end of the 3rd-step prayer in the Big Book on page 63. Because we're beginning a process of the deflation of the ego at depth, so that we can become, in fact, the person we're meant to be, that true self, by peeling away all of the facade, the walls that we've built that have imprisoned us. Originally meant to protect us, these walls have become prison walls. We don't know that we don't know. You've heard me say it. Until, in fact, we address brick by brick and deconstruct that wall, revealing and freeing our true self, tearing down the Hollywood storefront, allowing the true self to emerge. And that 7-step prayer, the prayer that I use every morning after my morning practice, my morning meditation practice, I close my intentional practice every morning with the prayer from the Big Book, by the way. I don't change it, because it has a great launching pad at the end as we go out from here to do your bidding, meaning to live in alignment with reality. That's my interpretation of it. God, I don't believe, has a plan. God doesn't, quote, have a will. But the will and the plan are reality as it's evolving, as it's emerging, as it's manifesting. And I want to be in the flow. I want to be in the flow, as the flow. And so please join me in this prayer. revised and adapted for this particular event that we've just concluded. My Creator, I am now willing that you should have all of me, healthy and unhealthy. I pray that you now remove from me every single self-centered inclination and behavior that stands in the way of my usefulness to you and my helpfulness to others. Grant me knowledge and power to go out from here to be in alignment with principles of reality. Amen. That's my website. Has lots of material on it, and I'll let you know when in fact it's been revised to include some more material, but also a different structure to reflect more accurately the events as they unfold on a daily, weekly basis. Thank you, everybody, for your attendance, your participation, your contribution. We'll meet again next month to talk about, in the same way, the next three concepts, 7, 8, and 9. There's some reading that you can do in preparation. There's certainly some resources on the website that will allow you to prepare some study questions, especially the checklists that come from the General Service Office. The Language of the Heart has lots more information depending on how much time you want to dedicate to it. All right. Thanks, everybody. See you next month. Bye-bye.